All right, everyone, 4 o'clock. Is this all right, or does it bother you? Is there an echo?
Perfect.
Perfect, okay, sounds good. I want to make sure that everybody can hear me in the room, even when I'm looking at the board. So, does anyone have any burning questions right up front, or should I just start from the beginning? Start from the beginning, just start from the we'll just do everything that we've done this entire semester in a 2-hour period. All right. All right, so we can cover a lot of ground today. In fact, we'll get most of it in. I just want to remind you that the equation sheet for exam 1 is up on the Canvas website. So if you want to take a look at that, that's what will be passed out to you if you're taking the online portion, or it'll be stapled to the back of your hard copy, okay? All right, so let's just start from the beginning. What I thought I'd do is, yes, question?
I actually just have kind of a random question. So
Yeah.
why did you decide to use Proctorio versus the paper copies, even if
Yep.
you're just going to do it in a classroom?
So I was talking, maybe a lot of you are in CBS. I was talking to Dina Wassenberg. You probably know her. And she said that they were using Proctorio in CBS, and she was doing a study on how students liked it. So I thought, for me, it's a great way to save trees, number one. And also to, because my exams, I just print out a lot of exams, and semester to semester, it's a ridiculous amount of paper. And it saves, for me, a lot of grading. So I thought I would try it. Yeah. Hand grading, we don't have a Scantron in our department, so hand grading those are crazy. I mean, it would take me about a week to get your grades back. So this way, you get your grades right away. If you do take a paper copy, it may just take me a few days. So I think it's a win-win, and we'll just see how it goes. If it's a big flop, then I won't use it next semester. All right, any other questions? Do you all feel comfortable using Proctorio? Okay, all right, we'll see how it goes. And again, don't panic if things aren't going your way. On Wednesday, I will print out probably about 40 hard copies just to make sure that everybody who wants one can have one. I only had about 20 people this morning that preferred the hard copy, and so I'm gonna double that, okay? All right, so what I want to do is I'm just going to start a running list of terms and concepts that I think that you should know. So every time I say a term that will be important for exam 1, I'll go ahead and just write it on this sheet, and then you'll have it. All right, so let's just start from the very beginning. We talked about, and remember, you won't be doing neuromuscular junction. That will be tabled until next section. So we'll just start with diffusion of uncharged particles. I want to get to, oops, do it with this one. All right. And the first thing that I would like to talk to you all about is the difference between the continuum perspective and the random walk, okay? So it was actually Fick, we talked about Fick's law of diffusion. I want to make sure that everybody remembers that equation, right? So we're talking about this right here. This was contribution to diffusion. What he thought was happening, he actually, yes, yeah, it's spinning. It's coming up. Yeah, thank you, there it is. What Fick's law states, he made the assumption that these solute molecules were like solid masses, like billiard balls. And they were moving in straight lines until they would collide with another particle or move through the pore. Now, when we talk about the continuum perspective versus random walk, both of them are correct. I actually have students that ask me, which one's the right one? They're both correct. They both have predictive value. It's just looking at diffusion from different perspectives, right? All right, so with Fick's law of diffusion, remember what you'll need to know is what the variables mean. This one is net flux in moles per second. F could also be depicted as J. So some older articles will use the variable J, but this is net flux in moles per second. is equal to area. This is the area of the semi-permeable membrane. So if I took this membrane right here, and I turned it maybe 45 degrees, you would see the membrane in area, centimeters squared. Centimeters by centimeters, or millimeters by millimeters. So area times the diffusion coefficient. Diffusion coefficient is describing the solute and solvent. Multiply that by the concentration gradient over the membrane thickness. Now let's break down the diffusion coefficient. Again, that is describing the solute and solvent. And so if we break that down, it's actually down here. The diffusion coefficient is equal to Boltzmann's constant. You don't need to know that. Times temperature. What I would like you to know is that KT is really the thermal agitation, right? Over 6 pi, R is the radius of the solute, V is viscosity of the medium. So the higher the viscosity, the thicker, more syrupy the solvent is. If the viscosity is low, it's more watery. All right, so a trick, I don't know if I mentioned this in class, but everything in the numerator has a direct relationship with net flux. So if the concentration gradient goes up or the surface area goes up, then the net flux is also going to increase. Okay, so there's a direct relationship. There's going to be an inverse relationship in the denominator. So as membrane thickness increases, net flux is going to decrease. Or in the denominator, if the radius increases, then the net flux is going to decrease. Or if the viscosity increases, then the net flux is going to decrease. Okay? Just a rule of thumb. So just know and think about, that particular concept and why that's important. Also, the negative sign is just telling you that solutes are always going to move. The net flux is going to be from high concentration to low concentration. Yes. So here you see the negative slope as a result of that, and that's why you have the negative sign. Okay, before we go any further, I do want to just okay, so going back to our Word document here, please know the difference or what the definition is of diffusion and diffusional equilibrium. Okay, so remember, diffusion is the distribution of solutes over time due to random thermal motion. And eventually they will be equally spaced over time until they reach diffusional equilibrium. That's when they're equally spaced. All right, so we can take a look at that. All right, so here's what we're talking about. Right, here's the definition of diffusion and diffusional equilibrium. Again, just simply, if you start by putting glucose molecules all on the left-hand side here, over time, due to random thermal motion, they will redistribute themselves until they're equally spaced. That's called diffusional equilibrium. Just want to make sure that you have that figure, that visual, when you're thinking about those definitions. All right, so 2 terms that are important. Then we went on to talk about Einstein's relation. X squared equals 2 dt. That's going to be on your equation sheet there. Let's take a look at that. Oops. All right. So why was that important? Well, Einstein's contribution, about 50 years later, in 1906, he came up with the random walk idea. So what they noticed, what they were starting to observe, was that particles over time were hopping from one place to another. This is 3 different molecules that were basically observed every 30 seconds. They plotted where they were, and they noticed that it looked fairly random. But Einstein noticed that a pattern to it. He actually noticed that he could derive an equation, x squared equals 2dt, to describe that movement. So, how did he do that? Basically, let me just jump to this one. I think this kind of gives you an idea of how that happens. And x squared equals 2dt is a very simplistic equation. It is illustrating what happens here if you have 1,000 molecules at position 0. They can either move to the left or the right, and that's it. They can only go, 2 points. So over time, if one of these molecules moves to the left, right, it could also, the next step, move back to the original position. Over time, you'll notice that it spreads out like a Gaussian curve. Most of the molecules are still at position 0, and then there's a few extremes that have gone out 100 units. So this is what happens over time, right? And Einstein saw this pattern, even though it looks completely random. He saw diffusion like hopping little fleas. And just a caveat, that's why this equation is so simplistic. It's just a 2-dimensional model. Once you get into 3 dimensions, the equation gets very complicated. But for teaching purposes, this is a nice one. So to describe diffusion and basically illustrating this area underneath, Einstein came up with this equation. He saw that the relationship between time and distance was this, x squared equals 2dt. It has a lot of predictive value. And so when you're trying to figure out how much time it's going to take for a molecule to diffuse a particular distance, you can basically use this equation. So, does anybody feel uncomfortable? Do you remember this from our very first problem set? Does anyone want to go through an example problem? Or do you feel pretty good about it? Pretty good about it? Want to go through an example?
Is this like the one that's on the practice test?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's just do that. Do you have the practice exam with you? Why don't we just do one? Because I can guarantee this will be on your exam. X squared equals 2dt. I'm assuming that the diffusion coefficient is equal to 1 times 10 to the minus 5th. Always the diffusion coefficient has units of centimeters squared per second, or some unit of distance squared per second. What are the variables?
If it takes 1 second to diffuse.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's probably not going to be that representative of, what is the next one? Where it actually says if a molecule moves 2 millimeters, is there a second one there?
I don't think so.
I don't know which one it is.
I think it's the one.
Question number 2, I think it is.
Yeah, it's the one, right? Yeah, it's this one. Let's see. Okay, it is. Okay, we can do that one. The one that is probably going to be more representative is on your problem set number 1. Do you want to go through that one? That's what's going to be more representative. So let's just go to problem set number 1. And I'll just show you really quickly how to do that. This one right here is more representative of what is going to be on your exam. Oops. Okay. So, I don't have my glasses with me, but I think this says, an epithelial cell is 2 millimeters from the nearest capillary. If the diffusion coefficient for glucose in the extracellular space is 1 times 10 to the minus fifth centimeters squared per second, how long will it take for glucose to diffuse from the capillary to the cell? All right, so 2 millimeters. All right, so X is equal to 2 millimeters. The first thing that I want you to notice is the units in the diffusion coefficient do not match the distance. So you're going to have to convert this right up front. I think it's easiest to do that. So X is actually equal to 0.2 centimeters. There is a conversion factor for all the conversions that you're going to need on your equation sheet. All right? So now what we want to do is plug this in and solve for t, right? So what we'll do is say x squared, 0.2 centimeters, times 0.2 centimeters. Oops, not yet. Multiply that, or I'm sorry, that equals 2 times 1 times 10 to the minus fifth centimeters squared per second, and we're solving for t. So what that is going to look like is 0.04, right, centimeters squared over, I'm going to multiply this out right away, 2 times 10 to the minus fifth centimeters squared per second, and that's going to equal t, right? So centimeters squared is actually going to cancel out. I'll just use my calculator. You all have a calculator with you today? Let's see, 0.04 divided by 0.02. All right, that should equal, you all with me? You want me to wait a minute or, okay. That's gonna equal 2,000 seconds. Does that look familiar? 2,000 seconds. Now, there's a FOIL on that problem set that says 200 seconds. I can't tell you how many students just, you know, they're in a hurry, this is a high stress kind of situation, and they just say, that's it, and they go on to the next question. Just be very careful about the answer you get and the units that you have. So, you need to convert this to minutes to get the right answer. All right, so just multiply that by 1 minute over 60 seconds, which is 1. So I'm going to divide 2,000 by 60, and that equals 33 point, is that right? 2,000 divided by 60. Yeah, 33.3 minutes. So that should be the right answer. Yes, 33.3 minutes. All right. That is going to be representative of what you're going to see on the exam. Not the one, I appreciate the one that you actually told me about. That one's a little more complicated because it's a two-stepped process. This is going to be more representative of what you're going to see on the exam. All right, so hopefully you appreciate what Einstein contributed to diffusion. He noticed that you could really use, he documented the relationship between distance and time. And what it really says is that diffusion is limited over macroscopic distances, right? If you're talking about just diffusion of a neurotransmitter that has to travel from the cell body to the axon terminal end, and it could be 1 meter long, that would take 32 years, right? So Diffusion alone, when you're talking about that kind of distance, is impossible. Animals actually have evolved mechanisms to overcome that limitation. We're talking about the circulatory system or molecular motors that transport these neurotransmitters down the axon to the axon terminal end, right? Because again, diffusion is limited over macroscopic distances. All right, so let's keep going. You will have to run some numbers with this equation, just so you know. I think you guys, if you have done your problem set, this should be fairly easy for you. All right, so then we went on to osmosis. All right, so with osmosis, let me just show you something. Let's go back to Einstein's, this figure right here. When you see an example of this, a diagram that looks like this, the balls right there are the solute molecules, and the space is the solvent. So now when we're talking about osmosis, what I want you to do is when you look at a figure like this, water molecules are always going to move from high concentration to low concentration. Osmosis is just an extension of diffusion. So when you look at this, you should notice right away that the inside compartment on the right-hand side has the higher water molecule concentration, right? On the left-hand side, it has the lower water molecule concentration. So in this case, the water is going to diffuse from the right-hand side to the left-hand side. All right, so that just takes a little bit of practice, okay? But that is a source of confusion. That's why I'm going through it. All right, so with that, we're talking about the idea of mole fraction. In this case, if we have two cubes of water that are exactly the same volume, I could take a scalpel and I can actually like cut out two perfect squares, cubes of water. As we add more solute to the right-hand side, we actually displace the water molecule concentration, right? We lower the water molecule concentration. In this case, the water is going to diffuse, the net diffusion of water will be from the pure water side into the solution, okay? It's the idea of mole fraction. So there are a few terms that I want you to know. So let's go back to our W here, our Word document. All right, so more terms. Do know the definition of osmosis. Again, that is the diffusion of water. The net diffusion will always be from high concentration to low concentration. And osmotic pressure, right? The osmotic pressure, if we were looking at, I'll show you the picture in just a minute. If we were looking at a piston, the amount of mechanical force that we would have to apply to prevent any kind of volume change, I'll show you in just a minute, that would equal the osmotic pressure. All right, and what else? Osmolarity and tonicity. Two other important terms. And then we'll talk about hypo and hyper osmolarity, tonicity. All right. Hopefully these are terms that you're fairly familiar with. When I say this, I'm talking about hypoosmotic, hypotonic, or hyperosmotic, hypertonic. All right. Oops. So with that, let's just finish up with osmolarity, osmosis in just a second here. Just to review, remember if you add 1 osmol of sodium chloride, right, 1 mole of sodium chloride, it's going to dissociate into 2 osmols. because it will dissociate into two different ions that both are acting as an osmolyte. Okay? All right. So here's the idea of osmotic pressure, right? In this case, what we're looking at is a piston that has a solution on the left-hand side and pure water on the right. And then there's this semi-permeable membrane. This piston is supposed to be kind of in a frictionless environment. And water is going to, the net movement of water is going to be from high concentration to low concentration. As that water moves into the solution, it actually changes the volume of that area where the solution is. Okay? So when that happens, the force, the mechanical force that you would have to apply to push that piston back to its original position, that force, that mechanical force, is equal to the osmotic pressure. All right? So that gives you an idea of osmotic pressure. And here's another scenario, but it's again giving you an idea of what osmotic pressure is. When a solution containing solutes is separated from pure water by a semi-permeable membrane, the pressure that must be applied to prevent the net flow of water into it is actually termed osmotic pressure. So if I go back to this diagram again, the force that I would have to apply to make sure the piston didn't move is also equal to the osmotic pressure. All right. So the last thing, we're skipping through a few things, but I better not skip through this. Osmolarity is the total solute concentration of a solution. It's a very general term. It can apply to two compartments within a beaker or within a flask. Some people use osmolarity and tonicity interchangeably, but I'm telling you there really is a difference. So I want to make sure that you all know not to use them interchangeably. Osmolarity is fine in any general term, but tonicity is actually referring to a cell in particular. All right, so it is referring to how cells swell or shrink depending on their environment, whether it's a hypertonic or hypotonic environment. So tonicity is the effect of a solution on cell volume, which depends on differences in osmolarity, but also on the types of solutes and the permeability of the membrane to those solutes. All right, so here's, question.
Okay, so you basically answering it right now. So osmolarity is just
General.
You ask like what the osmolarity of the cell is. Would you say like hypertonic, hypotonic? Like, would those be like?
Yeah, so I would say when you're referring to two compartments within a beaker or something like that with a semi-permeable membrane, one is more hyperosmotic than the other if they're two different concentrations. But tonicity is referring specifically to cells. Yeah, specifically to cells. Okay, so if you equilibrate a cell in a particular solution and you drop it into a hypertonic solution, right? So now you can see it's very concentrated. It's dropped into a very concentrated solution. Look at the space in between the solute molecules. This inside the cell is going to have a higher water molecule concentration than the hypertonic solution. So water is going to move from inside the cell to outside the cell, and the cell is going to shrink. If it's an isotonic solution, there's going to be no change in volume. If it is a hypotonic solution, then you've dropped it into a solution that's less concentrated than the inside of the cell. So this outside environment has a higher water molecule concentration than the inside, and water will tend to move into the cell and swell the cell. I said in class, I always think of hypotonic, like a big hippo, right? It's going to swell. All right, so just remember, take a look at those. I would draw, I think with any question like this, I would draw some kind of diagram, right? It just is easier. You won't make mistakes if that's the case. If you drop it into a hypotonic solution, right, the inside of the cell is going to be much more highly concentrated than the outside. Then you can clearly see that the outside actually has a higher water molecule concentration. Water's going to move into the cell and it's going to swell the cell. Okay, so just, I mean, it seems silly, but just draw this diagram and it just, the answer just emerges. It's just so much easier to see. All right. And then finally, we actually calculated osmotic pressure using this equation. Osmotic pressure is represented by pi. It's equal to the inside pressure minus the outside pressure, but we can also calculate it using RT, the ideal gas constant. Here's the units for that, times temperature in Kelvin, and then the concentration inside minus the concentration outside. Yeah?
Regarding like drawing things out,
Mhm.
so if we're doing the proctorial, is it going to be flagging us if we're like writing?
Yeah, you know, I thought about that because I know you're going to have to use your calculator, you're going to, you know, and no, it won't do that. If it does flag you, you'll immediately come up to me. I don't think it's going to lock you down, but I have the most lenient setting, and so you should be fine. If it does flag you for some reason, it sends me the video, and I can see, oh, he's just using his calculator, right? Yeah. Yes?
To go back to like
Oh, tonicity.
Yeah. The slide before, right?
Yes.
So you were talking about like on like the also like the definitions like hypoosmolarity and then tonicity. I'm just confused. Like, do you use those like interchangeably? Like you
Yeah.
said not to, but then
Yeah.
just referred to as a hypotonic and hypertonic. So it just kind of confused.
Sure. Good question. I know this can be a source of confusion. I get these questions all the time. So I would say if you're talking about a cell like this and you're dropping a cell into these different solutions, I would definitely use tonicity over osmolarity. So it's referring to how the solution is affecting cells in particular. But if I, had an example where we have a beaker with a semi-permeable membrane and we have different concentrations on each side, I would definitely use the term osmolarity in this case. Hyper and hypoosmolarity. Osmotic solutions. This would be the hyperosmotic, or this would be a hypoosmotic solution.
Okay.
Yep. All right, good questions. Yes. All right, so let's go to this one. We'll be finished with osmosis after this. So pi is equal to RT over the concentration inside and out. This is very typical of the question you'll get on an exam. You have a cell that's been equilibrated in a 1 molar solution. You've dropped it in 0.1 molar solution. And you have the R ideal gas constant is 0.082 atmospheres per Kelvin mole. Let's go ahead and write that out. All right, so what we have here is osmotic pressure is going to be RT times the concentration inside minus the concentration out. In this case, pi is going to be equal to 0.082 atmospheres per Kelvin mole. Okay, times temperature Now, your ideal gas constant is in Kelvin, so you have to make sure that you convert it to Kelvin. 25 degrees Celsius, remember you add 273, 298 Kelvin, right? So we're going to multiply that by 298 Kelvin. And then go ahead and draw a picture again. The cell is 1 molar. The outside is 0.1 molar, so it's a tenth of the inside, right? So this is going to be inside 1 molar minus outside 0.1. So this is going to be 0.9 molar when you subtract that out. So that would equal, you can see here, 22 atmospheres. Kelvin cancels out, moles cancel out. You're left with 22 atmospheres. Okay? Now, this picture doesn't show you the visual of the concentration. So the osmotic pressure is 22 atmospheres, but what's going to happen to the cell? Yeah. Water is going to go from high concentration to low concentration. It's going to move into the cell, and it's going to swell. How can we describe this solution? What word would you use to describe this solution? Hypotonic. Hypotonic. What's that? Yes, tonicity. That's right, tonicity, right. So I can guarantee there will be a question like that on the exam. Yeah, good job. So let's move into diffusion of charged particles. All right. I think this is where everyone has the most anxiety at first. All right. So let's just talk about a few terms that I want you to know. Oops. Okay. I think the main thing here is these two right here. You do need to know the difference between equilibrium potential and resting membrane potential. So I'm going to just take that over to our terms and concepts. Let's equilibrium potential. And the resting membrane potential. Okay. So, as I said in class, let me just make it easy. You need to know 4 things for the exam. And if you were able to be successful with your problem set, you shouldn't have any problem. Number 1, you should be able to calculate the equilibrium potential. If you're having any trouble, we can go through a few problems. Number 2, you need to be able to predict which way the ion is moving. Number 3, calculate driving force. And then number 4, you should be able to predict the resting membrane potential using the chord conductance equation. Okay, so we'll go through each one of those. All right, so let me just write a few terms here that are going to be important. You'll need to know Ohm's law, and with that, you'll need to know the definitions of conductance. Let's go back to driving force, current, resistance, conductance. Okay. We've got equilibrium potential, resting membrane potential. Oh, I should add, what is the electrochemical equilibrium? Oops, electrochemical equilibrium. All right, and remember that is actually WE equals WC. That's a condition where the electrical work is equal to the chemical work and they're exactly balanced. That's why we're calculating the equilibrium potential. I'm just going to move this up here because it's more appropriate up here. So do know the definition of the electrochemical equilibrium. All right, just a few terms to help with your studying. Would you like to go through a problem?
Yes.
Okay, yes. A definitive yes. All right. Would you like to go through one of the practice exam problems?
Yes.
Okay, let's do that. Let's do that. So I'll go ahead and we'll just go through the entire thing, right? That'll help you predict which way the ions are moving. All right. Okay, go ahead and give me some numbers. Let's go ahead and calculate, let's see, do you want me to bring up the practice exam? That might be easier. All right. So the practice exam, if you haven't found it on our website yet, you would just go to neurons. And at the bottom here is a tab called In Preparation for Exam 1. What you'll find is the practice exam. I'll just pull up the PDF version of it. And we can do one of the first questions here. Let's see if I can blow this up a little bit. Whoa, not that. Whoa. Okay, whoa. Jeez. Okay. There we go. All right. So let's just do this problem. All right. We'll go ahead and do sodium first. Figure out what the equilibrium potential for sodium is. All right. So the equilibrium potential for sodium is going to be RT over number of charge ZF times the natural log of the concentration of sodium outside over the concentration of sodium inside. Okay? So ENA is going to be equal to 8.3, right? 8.3 joules per mole Kelvin. Temperature is what in this case? What is it? Temperature is 25. So 25 plus 273, 298 Kelvin. 298 Kelvin. I'm just going to put this like this so you don't get too confused in a box. All right, what is Z? Plus 1. That's right. And F is 96,500 coulombs per mole. Natural log of 150 over 5. Yep. 150 over 5. All right, so what I tend to do, I just want to make sure that everyone knows how to do this, is I actually divide 150 by 5 first. Okay, or natural log of. 150 divided by 5. Did everybody get 3.4? Okay. I usually write that up on the top here. 3.4011. 97. All right. Then I multiply these together. 8.3 times 298 equals, divided by 96,500, 0.02563. I'll multiply that by 3.4. Alright, did everyone get 0.087? Okay. What are the units? Moles cancel out, Kelvin canceled out. We have left with joules per coulomb, which is volts, right? Then you just multiply by 1,000 to get 87 volts. I'm sorry, millivolts. 87 millivolts. So, it looks like already B is probably our answer, right? You can also solve for the equilibrium potential for potassium, but since this is multiple choice, you could save yourself some time and just put B, and you know that the equilibrium potential for potassium is minus 77. Saves you a little bit of time if you're in a crunch, but we could calculate this out as well. I'll just do that really fast. Equilibrium potential for potassium is equal to, this is the same, right? This part of the equation is exactly the same, so I don't have to redo that. That's 0.02563. So we're just going to multiply that by the natural log of 5 over 100. And that's going to give me natural log of 5 divided by 100 minus 2.99. Okay, and then I'm going to multiply that by 0.02563. Nice. I got minus 0.0767 volts. That would be 77 millivolts. Minus 77 millivolts. So we're doing good. The answer to this would be B. And this is very representative of what you're going to find on the exam. All right, but that's not the hard part, is it? The hard part is determining which way the ion is moving. Which way is the ion moving? So what I would encourage you, so now that we've already figured out what the equilibrium potentials are, B is the correct answer. I would highly encourage you to draw a graph, okay, and a cell. All right. Too hot to be doing this. I'm going to break out to a sweat soon. All right. Okay, so here's our graph. Our equilibrium potential for sodium is way up here at plus 87 millivolts. And our equilibrium potential for potassium is way down here at minus 77 millivolts. All right, but we can't decide which way the ion is moving until we figure out what the resting membrane potential is. Okay, so we have our relative conductances up here, And we have our equilibrium potentials. So now we're going to use the chord conductance equation. Membrane voltage, also equal to the resting membrane potential, okay, is equal to the conductance for sodium over the total conductance. Multiply that by the equilibrium potential for sodium, plus the conductance for potassium over the total conductance. Multiply that by the equilibrium potential for potassium. Now we've simplified this. This is a 2-ion system, but in reality, it's going to be all of the ions that are moving across the membrane. Could be 20 or more, could be 100 or more, right? So just want to make sure that you're going to use that equation. Can everybody see that under here? Okay. Up at the top, you can see that okay? Okay. So in this case, the conductance for potassium is 95%. The conductance for sodium is only 5%. Now, in a 2-ion system, that should add up to 1, right? So in this case, Vm is equal to 0.055%. The equilibrium potential for sodium is plus 87 millivolts, plus 95%, 0.95, times minus 77 millivolts. Now, before you do any calculations, you should just look at this equation and be able to predict where it is. It's going to be very close to minus 77, right? I would predict, without even doing anything, it's going to be around minus 70, right? All right, so has anybody done the calculation yet? Negative 68.8. That is, so it's negative 69, basically, yeah.
Is the ratio, like, of the conductance of FA and, like, the total, is that always gonna be given to us?
Always, yeah. You don't have to guess on that. It'll be given in that form, too. Okay, yeah. All right, so remember, if the conductance for potassium was 100%, then it would be minus 77, right? So again, let's bring it back since you know something about action potentials now. As you change the conductances, you open up all those voltage-gated sodium channels, and the conductance rises. So now this is 90%, and this is only 10%. You can see how it's going to pull the membrane voltage closer to the equilibrium potential for sodium, right? That's why you're getting the action potential that you are. The action potential waveform is because all of those voltage-gated sodium channels open. It pulls the membrane voltage closer to the equilibrium potential for sodium. Those inactivate, the voltage-gated potassium channels come on board. It pulls the membrane voltage back down. As those conductances change, it's going to play a role in the action potential waveform, right? That's why there's an ionic basis to the action potential waveform. Okay? All right, so bring it back here. The answer again would be B. Now we can figure out which way the ion is moving. These are dashed because they're only theoretical values. This would be the voltage that would have to exist to prevent the net movement of sodium down its concentration gradient. This would be the voltage that would have to exist to prevent potassium, the net movement of potassium out of the cell. So here's where the actual resting membrane potential is. It's minus 69 millivolts. I would say, I think is for those that are taking the online exam, I'm going to have you turn in your scrap sheet of paper. Just make sure you put your name at the top. So if you draw a picture and you're really close and you just happen to make one mistake, I can give you some partial credit if I see your work, right? So it'll probably be good for you to write everything out, draw pictures, write everything out, and then I can see where you went wrong. You can come into my office and I can give you some partial credit. All right, so the question is, when I look at this graph, let's go ahead and draw a cell, right? For sodium, right? High concentration on the outside relative to the inside. Here's what the concentration gradient looks like. Sodium is a positive ion. And the key is this. Just put your hand here, right? This is your reference. Is the actual membrane voltage more positive or is it more negative? It's more negative, right? Okay, so I usually just put a little negative sign. These are going to attract, and sodium is going to move into the cell with its concentration gradient. Okay, so another way of saying that is that the electrical work is not sufficient enough to prevent the movement of sodium down its concentration gradient. Yeah?
How do you know that it's negative?
How do you know that this is negative?
Yeah, I got lost there.
Yeah, that's okay. I would say, I would put my hand here. If this resting membrane potential is up here, anywhere above or more depolarized than this value, then I would put a plus sign there. If it's more negative anywhere, then I would put a negative sign, okay? So, and what we're saying here is anything that's more negative, sodium is going to go in. Anything more positive, sodium will be going out. Okay? That was a great question. Sometimes it's just that little piece of the puzzle that you're like, now that makes sense. All right, yes?
So in one of the other practice problems, like chlorine is an example where
Yeah.
it's negative.
That's a hard one.
So is it just flipped?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. So let's just say that we calculated the equilibrium potential for chloride, and let's just say it's minus 50. Okay? So the equilibrium potential for chloride is minus 50 millivolts. Put your hand right here. This is your reference. Chloride is a negative ion. I always put the ion of interest inside the cell. Ask yourself, where does the actual membrane voltage sit? Is it more positive or is it more negative?
Or negative?
It's more negative, right? So chloride will repel and it will actually go out of the cell in this case.
Even if it's like against its gradient?
Even if it's against, okay, so you've built the gradient. The gradient's built right into the equilibrium potential.
Okay,
Yeah,
that makes more sense.
yeah, yeah. Pretty good? Okay. So in this case, the driving force for sodium is going to be this difference right here. Has a huge driving force. So it's going to be the Vm minus 69 minus the equilibrium potential. So it'll be minus 87. So that equals 156, right? Minus 156. So now you can see this is starting to make sense here. The driving force for sodium and potassium are minus 156. So yes, that could be it. B, we can already eliminate. It's not minus 146 or 164. So it has to be either A or D. And we already decided that sodium was going to move into the cell. So it actually has to already be A, right? The answer has to be A. So you can eliminate, I mean, if you're in a hurry, you can eliminate calculating everything. I mean, you can calculate everything, but if you can eliminate some of these foils already, then you don't have to calculate everything. All right? Feel pretty good about that, y'all? Pretty good? All right, so the 4 things: you'll need to calculate equilibrium potential, predict which way the ion is moving, determine driving force, and you're going to have to calculate or predict the actual membrane voltage using the cord conductance equation. All right. All right, so I just want to go over some of the terms. Let's see here. How are we doing on time? All right. What's that? I know. I could talk for hours about physiology. Seriously, it's actually sad. I could be here till 10 o'clock. All right. So let's see here. Just briefly, let's go through. I don't want to go through too many because we have to keep going here. Let's just talk about Ohm's law. Current is flow, all right? In this case, we're talking electrical terms. It is coulombs, which is a unit of charge per second. It's like a river of charge. If we were talking about this in hydraulic terms, which we will when we get to blood flow, it's going to be volume per second, mils per second. Okay, so just think of current as a flow of charge. Driving force is the push or the pull that an ion experiences in an electrical field. So Einstein said that diffusion was like little fleas hopping. Huxley actually said it was like fleas hopping in the wind. The wind is the electrical part of it. So the driving force is the push or the pull that an ion experiences in an electrical field. Resistance is the difficulty which ions move across the membrane. Conductance is just the inverse of that. Okay? I had someone in my office today when I was talking about resistivity. Remember the lambda, right? Lambda is Rm times diameter over 4 rho, the resistivity. And I was talking about resistivity, and the student actually said, oh, that's like conductivity, right? The ease at which ions move in the axon, right? It's still the same. It's the inverse. Conductivity and resistivity are inverse of each other. All right. So that's pretty much it. I think that I've covered everything. You will not see the Goldman-Hodgkin cats. It is something in your textbook, but you won't have to. You won't have to memorize this equation. Yes, okay. It's just the cord conductance equation. It's much easier to use. Yes, yeah. So don't worry about Goldman-Hodgkin cats. All right. So I think we've covered everything. Let's go ahead and move on to 4. I'm just going to simplify it. It's 4 for me. It's not 4 for you. It is facilitated diffusion. All right. So just to make it simple, I won't give you any equations about permeability. We spent some time with permeability when we were talking about passive diffusion. What I want you to remember with passive diffusion is that it doesn't require a protein, right? The concentration gradient is what is important. So the flux is going to have a direct relationship with the concentration gradient. And saturation is not possible. There's no saturation with passive diffusion. All right, so that's different than facilitated diffusion. With facilitated diffusion, this requires a channel or a carrier, some kind of protein transporter is required. At this point, no metabolic energy is needed, no ATP. It does depend on the concentration gradient, and saturation is possible. So this is the figure to think about with this one. The green is giving you some information about passive diffusion. The purple is giving you information about facilitated diffusion. So green, in passive diffusion, flux rate is limited only by the concentration gradient. But as we talked about in class, facilitated diffusion is dependent on the number of channels or carriers in the membrane, and, it doesn't say this here, and the turnover rate of those carriers, Vmax. Okay? All right. So we went on to talk about different characteristics of specifically ion channels. We talked about conductance, conducting and non-conducting states. We talked about gating and selectivity. So, just very simply, conductance is again the ease at which these ions move across the membrane. Gating is how these channels open, close, or inactivate. So there are voltage-gated channels. They open as a result of a change in membrane potential. There are stretch-gated or mechanically gated channels. If I took a pipette and I pushed on a cell, right, pushed on it, it would stretch these cytoskeletal elements and open the channel. Those are stretch-gated. So you can imagine if a cell starts to swell, it's going to actually trigger these cytoskeletal elements to stretch. And it is going to open channels. We actually applied this later on. Okay? Then we have phosphorylation-gated. CFTR is a good example of phosphorylation-gated channels. You need a phosphorylation event for it to open. And then ligand-gated channels. Let's put it all together. We talked about graded potentials in the last few days. Graded potentials are initiated by ligand-gated receptors. So these are also known as ionotropic receptors. Ionotropic are ion channels. Yeah?
You talked about CFTR, right?
Yep.
Phosphorylation.
Yes.
Isn't CFTR an active ABC?
Yeah. So I hate to use this word. I'm sure someone that is an expert in evolution is going to kill me by saying this, but it used to be an ABC, primary active transporter. And it devolved. Really, it evolved into a channel. So it lost its capability to be an active transporter, and it is now considered an ion channel. Yep, good question. All right, so then we kind of zoomed in on specifically voltage-gated sodium channels. We have closed, these are states, these are gating states, closed, open, and inactivated. Now, let's put it all together. Today, we actually had an exercise where people were lined up in the classroom. Yes, we did. We talked about this. We actually acted out a voltage-gated sodium channel today in its closed, open, touch your neighbors, inactivated, closed, right? So what this is, I'm going to just roll it all in. Closed to open is called activation. Open to inactivated is called inactivation. And then the channel has to recover from inactivation back to its closed state. So what that looks like is this is the activation gate, this M gate. When it opens, it allows for sodium to rush in. Then the H gate, that's the inactivation gate. It closes. And when that happens, no matter how strong the second stimulus, it is not available to open in the inactivated state, right? Not available to open. Anybody remember what that term is? Absolute refractory period. Yes. Did you say refractory? Yes. So it's refractory period. So when it is inactivated, it is in the absolute refractory period. No matter, it doesn't matter how strong that second stimulus, you cannot fire another action potential. And then the channel has to recover from inactivation, right? Once it is recovered from inactivation to the closed state, then it is available to open. Okay? So both the closed and the inactivated state are non-conducting states, but there's a real difference between the two. Okay? All right, good job. Then we talked about selectivity. Selectivity of electrolytes depends on the size of the solute, of the ion, the interaction within the pore, and remember that ease of dehydration. So when a molecule is in solution, it is surrounded by water molecules. Okay, so for potassium here, it looks something like this. Water molecules, it would be the oxygen that would associate with that positive charge. Right? So you have these water molecules that are surrounding the potassium. It's interesting that selective potassium channels mimic the amino acids, the carbonyl amino acids actually mimic the oxygen and how it surrounds the potassium ion. So it slides right from the water molecules right into the pore region. That's why we have selective potassium channels. So that's the ease of dehydration. All right, so do you know the what depolarization is and hyperpolarization? Those are another few terms. I'm gonna have to update this when I get home. All right, carrier molecules are just about conformational changes. And let's move to active transport. Okay. All right. I think with active transport, the two things that I really want you to know is the difference between primary active transporters and secondary active transporters. Primary active transporters, okay, so active transport can move molecules from low concentration to high concentration. So it is moving molecules against their concentration gradients, but energy is required. The net movement is from low to high, but energy is required. So protein transporter is required, energy is required, and molecules can move from low to high. Primary active transporters use ATP. Secondary active transporters use the concentration gradient from one molecule. That molecule is moving with its concentration gradient. There's a lot of energy in that concentration gradient to move other molecules against their concentration gradient. So secondary active transport couples the movement of one molecule to the movement of the second molecule. So we did some fun activities with active transport. I did go through how the sodium-potassium ATPase works. Essentially, if you saw something like this, you would need to label it, right? It does, there's a hydrolysis of ATP. This is the energy that's needed. ATP is hydrolyzed to ADP, and it's essentially phosphorylating the pump. So it leaves a phosphate group attached to the pump. And then basically what happens is ATP here, let's see if you can see that all right, yep. ATP binds to the pump, It hydrolyzes ATP to ADP, and then this is the phosphorylation. That is the energy needed, these are the sodium molecules, to promote a conformational change, which then delivers the sodium ions out of the cell, right? That's what is responsible for establishing the gradient with high sodium outside, high potassium inside. So it forces all the sodium out of the cell. And then it actually increases the affinity for potassium. Potassium binds to the pump. The phosphate group is released, another conformational change, and potassium is delivered inside the cell. Pretty good? Secondary active transport. I think what's really important with that, these were a lot of examples, but to be honest, oh, there's Spencer, super cute, I know. Just about made me want to cry that day. I was like, oh my gosh, he's just so adorable. So secondary active transport, these are some of the players. Sodium proton exchanger, chloride bicarbonate exchanger, those were important in pH regulation. So we actually applied some of the transporters that we were using. Some terms that are important, again, what is an electroneutral carrier and what is an electrogenic carrier? Electroneutral transports uncharged molecules or an equal number of charged particles. One good example was the pump that is located in the parietal cells, right here. Parietal cells in the stomach. 2 potassium into the cell, 2 protons out. That is a good example of electrogenic. Neutral net charge transfer. All right, and then electrogenic is there is a net transfer of charge. So, good example of that is the sodium-potassium ATPase. It exchanges 3 sodium ions for 2 potassium. There is a net transfer of charge. All right, so here's where we should draw gene-protein coupled receptors. You want to go through those signaling cascade? Okay, yes. All right. So, ask me questions. We'll go through it. Let's see here. For those that are watching the video, yes?
I have a question about how in-depth we need to know the CFTR and the
Yeah.
GQ pathway.
Okay, so CFTR is just more pertaining to your homework assignment. Okay. So I think if you just went over your homework assignment, you would be fine for CFTR. Okay. But when we're talking about GS, GI, and GQ, I had a person in my office asking about this today. I don't want you to have to memorize all of it. You're not going to write it all out, so you don't have to memorize all the names, but you do need to recognize the pathway. So remember, this is multiple choice. There are a few questions pertaining to GS, GI, and GQ. For instance, if I ask you about adenylyl cyclase, you should automatically know that that is part of the GS-GI pathway. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about. If I talk about calcium, automatically you should think, okay, that's a GQ coupled receptor, okay, or IP3, GQ. So you just need to recognize the pathway, okay? All right, so let's see here. Cell signaling, part 1, here we go. I'll just put this on the board. All right. All right. Okay. Ooh, yeah. Okay, so I think for simplicity's sake, I think this diagram is pretty good. Do you want me to draw it on the board, or you're okay with this? All right. So remember the primary messenger, the first messenger is the ligand. Okay? The ligand binds to its receptor. Luckily for us, GS and GI, the pathway is almost identical. Okay, so when the ligand binds to the receptor, it basically causes a conformational change of the G proteins that are closely associating with the receptor. When that happens, when the ligand binds to its receptor, the alpha subunit exchanges GDP for GTP. Now remember, the alpha subunit itself is a GTPase. So eventually it's going to hydrolyze GTP back to GDP. So basically what I want you to think about is the timer has been set. Tick-tock, tick-tock, it migrates over to adenylyl cyclase. Eventually it's going to hydrolyze and go back to its original position. GS, the stimulatory pathway, binds to the alpha subunit with GTP attached to it, is going to bind to adenylyl cyclase, activating it, stimulating it. That increases the hydrolyzation? I don't know if that's a word. It hydrolyzes more ATP to cyclic AMP, increasing cyclic AMP within the cell. Cyclic AMP also has effects on the cell. It activates protein kinase A, right? You can see that here. Don't see protein kinase A, but it just says cyclic AMP dependent protein kinases. Usually that's protein kinase A. Okay, protein kinase A in itself is a kinase, so it goes on to activate other proteins. So it's a true amplification response, right? It goes on, protein kinase A goes on to activate other enzymes, which then go on to have their own responses. True amplification, it's a global stimulation of the cell. All right, like I said, luckily the GI pathway is almost identical. Now, it does have its own G proteins, even though I'm saying G alpha, G beta, G gamma. This would be, in the first scenario, this would be GS alpha, GS beta, GS gamma. Totally different G proteins for GI, okay? So this would be GI alpha, GI beta, GI gamma. Again, the alpha subunit, when the ligand binds to its receptor, alpha subunit exchanges GDP for GTP, migrates over to adenylyl cyclase, but in this case, it inhibits adenylyl cyclase. Okay, so there is a basal tone associated with adenylyl cyclase. If the alpha subunit wasn't associating with adenylyl cyclase, it would still be hydrolyzing ATP to cyclic AMP at a specific rate. So when the GI alpha subunit binds to adenylyl cyclase, it inhibits adenylyl cyclase, and you actually get a decrease in cyclic AMP within the cell. Yes?
Is it the same for GS then, where is adenylyl cyclase already working, it's just increasing its production?
Exactly.
Okay.
So there's a basal tone. It does, without the alpha subunit, even with GS, it is hydrolyzing ATP to cyclic AMP at a specific rate. When GS alpha binds to adenylyl cyclase, it increases the hydrolyzation. I'm trying to say hydrolyzation again. It actually hydrolyzes more ATP, increasing the amount of cyclic AMP within the cell. Pretty good? Any questions? Yes.
Other than just identifying, right,
Mm-hmm.
which of the three it is, are we also labeling technically each step, or you just want us to recognize the differences in order for us to identify the difference between GI, GS, and GQ?
Yeah, so let me give you something like this. This is the GQ. If I actually say something about phospholipase C, and I give a drug that increases the activity of phospholipase C, you would say, okay, if I increase the activity of phospholipase C, I'm going to get more DAG and more IP3 production, which is going to enhance the calcium that's going to flood into the intracellular space. it really won't affect the upstream process. You're not going to get any additional increase in the activity of the G proteins. It would all be downstream from that drug, right? Those are the type of questions that you'll get on the exam, right? You'll need to know where it is in the pathway, what molecules are being affected, which molecules are not being affected. So that's where you kind of need to know the pathway itself, but it's all multiple choice. You don't have to memorize PIP2, DAG, IP3. You just have to know the pathway in general. Yeah. Yes.
Could you then go over on the practice exam question 17?
Sure. Can you tell me what that is? Can you just read it?
Okay, something, it's a
Oh, pertussis toxin.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And then, yeah, that one.
So this is why it's not on your exam.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this one is more complicated. Your question on your exam is much more straightforward. Okay? So what pertussis toxin does, it is a toxin that doesn't allow for the exchange of GDP to GTP. So it is, get this, it's inhibiting an inhibitory pathway. Get that, right? It's inhibiting an inhibitory pathway. So what would it do to cyclic AMP? Go up. It's a brain teaser. Yeah, I used to have that on the exam, and too many people, I could see how it could be, that's a harder one to wrap your head around. Yeah. But you would know that it has to have something to do with cyclic AMP, right? You'd know the general players in the GS-GI pathway, okay? Okay, so let's keep going. Man, I'm running out of time here already. Yeah. Okay. Oh, let's go through the GQ pathway real quick. Okay, so GQ, essentially what you see here is the GQ alpha, beta, and gamma. Once the ligand binds to its receptor, alpha subunit exchanges GDP for GTP. It activates phospholipase C. Phospholipase C is an enzyme that breaks down PIP2. You can see here, PIP2, right there. It's not great, but PIP2 is broken down to IP3 and DAG, diacylglycerol. That remains in the membrane, DAG. It actually activates protein kinase C. IP3 enters into the cell, and it binds to its receptor on the smooth endoplasmic reticulum that has all that calcium housed in it, and it releases all the calcium. It can activate molecules like calmodulin. Let's see, I think calmodulin here. Calmodulin is activated. So it goes on to activate other proteins and kinases. Calmodulin, you don't need to really know about that now, but when we get to smooth muscle, it's very important in smooth muscle contraction and vasoconstriction. Okay? All right, calmodulin. All right, so let's see here. I think I'm going to simplify this. There's lots. Oh, question.
I just had a question about calcium regulation.
Yeah.
Because you had a slide where you went over a lot of regulators.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want us to know all of those?
It's going to be more important that you know those later in muscle. Okay? It's a good question, but I think right now just concentrate on the pathway for GQ. Yep, good question. So I'm going to simplify this one really quickly. There's lots of transporters and channels that are involved in regulatory volume increase and regulatory volume decrease. The take-home message here is that these channels move solutes, if we're talking about to shrink cells, move solutes out first. Water will always follow the solute movement. Okay, so to shrink cells, if you move all the solutes out, water's going to follow, cells are going to shrink. To swell cells, you're going to move solutes in, water is going to follow that movement to swell cells. And this is really to help cells maintain some kind of homeostasis, right? If they are dropped into a hypotonic solution, they're going to start to swell. And they're going to stretch those cytoskeletal elements, opening up these channels. What it's going to try to do is try to shrink it back to normal. So it's going to move solutes out. Water will try to follow if it's successful. If it's too much of a hypotonic solution, like if you drop a cell in pure water, it's going to burst. It's going to overwhelm these mechanisms and it'll lyse, right? But these will try very hard to try to shrink the cell back to normal. Regulatory volume decrease in this case. Okay, don't worry about this. You can already see that this is a muscle, right? Ryanodine receptors and Circa pumps, you'll learn all about when we get to the muscle section. This is something, though, that I want you to think about. This is to regulate pH within the cell. You obviously have buffers within the cell that are important. pH is a measure of free proton levels within the cell. Free proton levels. So this is where you overwhelm your buffering system. If you start to become more acidic, the pH is falling to 7.1, 7.0. What that's going to do is it's going to activate a sodium proton exchanger. It's going to use the sodium gradient to move protons out of the cell. Move protons out of the cell. So going to the document camera, this actually uses the sodium gradient. Oops. Whoa, there we go. Sodium gradient to move protons out of the cell. Okay?
And that's if it's acidic.
That's if it is too acidic. There's mechanisms that sense the acid, the level of protons within the cell, and it will activate, let's go back to this, it does activate a sodium proton exchanger. And that helps to bring the pH back up to normal. Okay? So it makes sense if the cell becomes too basic, right, alkaline, then the first thing that would happen is you would decrease the activity of the sodium proton exchanger. But you also would increase the activity of a chloride bicarbonate exchanger. So this is the opposite effect. You would first inhibit the sodium proton exchanger, and then in this case you would want to use the chloride gradient to remove buffer from the cell. Bicarbonate. Why would that be important? Why would you want to remove buffer from the cell? Right? By removing your buffer, you're going to increase the amount of free protons in the cell. That will help to bring back pH back down to normal levels. So now we're applying what we learned about secondary active transporters and how that applies to cell physiology. Okay, so, man, we are kind of running behind. Let's see. Epithelial cells are really important. I'm just going to give you, I'll write those terms out like we talked about. I think the main important thing about epithelial cells, which we will talk about again when we get to GI tract, kidney, right? These are all really important to know. Essentially, what we're talking about here is what are tight junctions? What are gap junctions? What does it mean when I say polarization? So when tight junctions are formed, when cells become contact inhibited, this is a sliced bread model, literally. Looks like sliced bread, right? These are epithelial cells. Tight junctions form when they come in contact with each other. That allows for certain proteins to be sorted either to the apical side. This is facing the interior of the lung, small intestines, okay? Apical side is also called the luminal side, or the basolateral side. This is facing the blood supply, so this is called the serosal side also. So it sorts different proteins. That's a process called polarization. Polarization. These are called tight junctions, right? It increases the epithelial resistance. Resistance is the difficulty at which ions move across the membrane. Paracellular means ions are moving in between cells, paracellular. Transcellular means they're moving through the cell. So, tight junctions, gap junctions, paracellular, transcellular, apical membrane, basolateral membrane, lots of terms associated with epithelial cells. In this case, on the exam, it's really just about terminology. Okay? So, when you think about how a gland works, first, with polarization, it starts to move certain ions like chloride through the cell, transcellular pathway. It sets up a voltage gradient for the movement of sodium paracellularly. Which way is the water going to follow? The water is going to follow the solute movement, right? That's how glands work. The fluid actually comes through as well, and then it delivers, fluid onto the surface of your skin, into the small intestines, into the lumen of your tubules within your kidney, in the nephron. So it's just giving you some idea of mechanics. All right, pretty good? All right, let's get to neurons. Yes, let's talk about neurons are actually awesome because we're applying everything we learn now, right? This is an application of concepts you've already learned. All right, so with the nervous system, I want you to actually concentrate on just some of the different cell types. Neurons, glial cells, astrocytes, oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system, Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system, right? Mainly those cell types. Now, I had someone in my office asking me about the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic, and did you have to know this whole diagram, right? In general, I just want you to know some of the just basic stuff, right? Sympathetic, the cell bodies come from the thoracic and lumbar regions. Parasympathetic, the cell bodies originate from the cranial and sacral regions. The ganglion is very close to the spinal cord with sympathetic, close to the effector cells, the effector organs with the parasympathetic, right? So that's just an overview of sympathetic and parasympathetic. You don't need to know neurotransmitters. You don't need to know receptors. That will come later. All right? That will come later. So let's concentrate on neurons. I think that's going to be much more important. Most of the questions are going to... First of all, I need you to know the difference between graded potentials and action potentials. Okay? Okay, so I've already told you this. Sometimes it's just, reiterating. Make sure that you know how to label this diagram. You need to know the anatomy of a neuron. Okay? Don't forget the function on the very left-hand side here. Make sure you know that as well. Signal reception, signal integration, signal conduction, and signal transmission. Okay. Now it's really about dissecting out what is a graded potential and what are action potentials. I think it might be a good exercise to do this on the board. What do you say? Okay? So let's do this. Graded potentials and action potentials. Let's compare and contrast. There are some questions regarding this. Okay, first thing, let's let's talk about a graded potential. How is it initiated? How is it initiated? How is this electrical, yes? Yes, what kind of stimulus? Haha. I'll give you a hint. A presynaptic neuron is actually innervating a postsynaptic neuron. What's happening at that junction? Neurotransmitters being released, right? So this is actually initiated by a ligand-gated receptor. The neurotransmitter is the ligand. Ligand-gated receptor. Okay, ligand-gated receptor initiates this graded potential. All right, what else? It's usually in the cell soma, right? Cell soma, it's I'll say this, graded potentials are, there's no action potentials in the cell soma, only graded potentials. So these receptors could conduct sodium, they could conduct chloride, so it could initiate a hyperpolarization or a depolarization event. Okay? Yeah.
When we're talking about graded potentials and like the hyperpolarization and depolarization,
Mhm.
why would a cell ever want to hyperpolarize if it's always going to be a depolarization event that makes the action potential?
There's a lot of different inputs. Some receptors, like GABA receptors, actually conduct chloride. All of these different inputs, whether they're depolarizing or hyperpolarizing, some of those inhibitory neurons are regulating the response and preventing action potentials, right? So, like I said, there's a lot of different inputs that can happen. So what we'll talk about when we get to the muscle section is, anybody heard of tetanus, right? You have to be tested for tetanus, right? If you have tetanus, usually it causes locked jaw first, and then if it goes systemic, it causes every single muscle in your body to contract. It's very painful. People have a signature arching of their back, and every muscle in their body just is cramping. You guys know how painful a cramp is, right? Can you imagine every muscle in your body? That happens because of tetanus toxin, right? Clostridium tetani. And it's inhibiting an inhibitory neuron that is causing action potentials in muscle. Yeah. So we'll talk more about that. But it can be a hyperpolarization or a depolarization. All right. So remember, it radiates out in all directions, right? Radiates out in all directions. It can sum in time and space. That's called temporal summation and spatial summation. Oops, temporal and spatial summation. Okay, temporal summation is with one presynaptic firing, yes. One presynaptic neuron and its particular firing rate, right? If you speed up the firing rate, the response is going to sum in time. That's one presynaptic neuron pertaining to its firing rate. So it's summing in time. As you speed up that firing rate, you can get a more enhanced depolarization event. Spatial is when you have two synaptic neurons, and where they radiate out, where they overlap, they're going to sum in space. That's a spatial domain. Okay, so what we're talking about here, let me just, right, this is what we're talking about. Synapse 1 right? That's one presynaptic neuron. If it increases the frequency of firing, that firing rate, you can get summation, which is at the top there. That's temporal summation. With spatial summation, now we're talking about two synapses and where the response radiates in space, right? Distance. That's when they overlap. That's where you're going to get summation, spatial summation. So think about it this way. Remember, whenever you get firing, it's like a pebble dropping in a very placid lake. It's going to ripple out in all directions, and all of that input is going to sum in time and space. Okay? Sum in time and space. Okay, so you also, with this effect, the response is dependent on the strength of the stimulus, right? The response is dependent on the strength of the stimulus. The more neurotransmitters are released, the more receptors are activated, the stronger the response. Response is dependent on the strength of the stimulus. So there's a lot of gray area, right? It's like an analog effect. What else? Oh, one of the main things, one of the most important things, is that this response decays with distance. The response decays with distance. Okay? So that's where you see this here. Right? Decays with distance, and that decay can be described by the length constant. Okay? All right. Action potentials, how are they stimulated? Graded potential comes into the axon hillock region. What's the first thing that happens? Integration. Yes. What do you need? You need just a 15 millivolt depolarization, and then what happens? What is threshold? What is being stimulated, activated?
Is it the voltage gated?
It is. It is. It is the voltage-gated sodium channels that are initiating this response. Voltage-gated voltage-gated sodium channels that are important. So it's a graded potential that comes into the axon hillock region. It activates voltage-gated sodium channels. Once that happens, it is a depolarization event. Only a depolarization event. It always goes to the same peak because it depends on how many voltage-gated sodium channels are in that inner nodal space, right? So it always reaches the same peak, right? You get action potential at one node, action potential at the next node, right? The peak is always the same as it goes down the axon. Okay, so the response is independent of the stimulus. All you need to do is reach threshold. You can depolarize the cell way above threshold, but it doesn't matter. The peak will always be the same all the way down the axon. All you have to do is reach threshold. And by definition, threshold is the voltage required to activate voltage-gated sodium channels. That's threshold. So you can provide a stronger depolarization event. You can depolarize the cell to 0 if you want. but the peak of the action potential will always be the same because it's more relevant to the voltage gated, the cluster of voltage gated sodium channels in that internodal space. Okay? Response is independent of the stimulus. This is an all or none event. This is a digital response, all or none event. If you activate action potential at that first node, it should activate all the way down the axon. If everything is normal with the myelin sheath, right? Okay, response is independent of the stimulus, all or none response. The peak, the amplitude of the action potential waveform is always the same. What else? This, it has a refractory period, right? These have refractory periods because of the inactivation of the voltage gated sodium channel. All right. So here's a nice table that kind of sums everything up. I should write here with action potentials that cannot be summed. Cannot be summed in time and space. What else? Has a refractory period. It is conducted without decrement. There's no decay in the response. Only a depolarization event initiated by those graded potentials coming into the axon hillock. Pretty good? All right. Let's keep going here. Those are a lot of terms. Anybody confused by any of the terms that we talked about?
Could you say threshold?
By definition, is the voltage required to activate voltage-gated sodium channels. What other things are important? Refractory period. Absolute refractory is when the voltage-gated sodium channels are inactivated and unavailable to open. And during that time period, no matter how strong the stimulus, you can't initiate another action potential. Relative refractory is when you're in the after hyperpolarization event. Voltage-gated sodium channels have recovered from inactivation. They're closed so that they can be opened, but you have to provide a stronger stimulus in order to reach threshold. Okay, that's relative refractory. What other things are important? So the demonstration that we had in class today, we learned, number one, because of the nature of the voltage-gated sodium channels and the way that they're organized along the axon, it promotes the signal to go in a unidirectional fashion, in a one-way fashion. But it also sets an upper limit on the frequency that can be fired in the axon, right? Sets an upper limit on frequency of firing. Let's see. Okay, one more thing. Let's see. How are we doing on time? Jeez, this has just flown by. All right. I want you to know a little something about lambda, the length constant. You guys are probably dying. It's like 2 hours. It seems like literally 20 minutes to me. I mean, yeah, seriously. Okay, so remember this will be on your exam as well. Lambda is equal to membrane resistance times diameter over 4 resistivity. Resistivity. So there's a question on the exam pertaining to lambda. Just know the relationship again between these variables and lambda. What is lambda? Lambda is describing the decay. So the larger the lambda, the farther the signal is going to propagate down the axon. That's a good thing. The farther it's going to propagate down the axon. It correlates with conduction speed. So it's going to increase the conduction speed. So with membrane resistance, if you have a myelin sheath, right? That myelin sheath acts as an insulator. It is literally like putting duct tape around a copper wire. It's an insulator. It doesn't allow for potassium to leak out. So it increases membrane resistance, increasing lambda to propagate that signal farther down the axon, increasing conduction speed. That's why you put a tape around a copper wire, right? It acts as an insulator, increasing membrane resistance. Okay, so what happens with multiple sclerosis? It degrades the myelin sheath, right? It allows for potassium to leak out, so it can't propagate farther, right? It decays over a much shorter distance, and you probably won't get another action potential at that next node. You learned that today, right? Because it decreases membrane resistance, allowing those ions to leak out, and it decreases the lambda. Okay? So when you think about membrane resistance, think about myelin sheath. Yes?
What is rho again?
Yeah. So D is diameter, right? Same idea, giant squid axon. It's big for a reason. Increasing diameter increases lambda. Rho is saying something about resistivity. All right, so if you don't have a whole lot of solutes inside the axon, when you open up those voltage-gated sodium channels, think about these like billiard balls. They might collide with a few, but they won't propagate farther down the axon if there's not much solute. In that case, the resistivity is going to be high, so lambda is going to be low. There's an inverse relationship. If there's a lot of solute, right, in a giant squid axon, this is like 400 millimolar of potassium inside. So when sodium rushes into the cell, it collides with a lot of solutes, propagating that signal farther and farther down the axon. It actually decreases resistivity, let me say this another way, increases conductivity, right? And then you increase lambda as a result. Yes?
How does that compare to membrane resistance, the RF?
Yep. So membrane resistance is really what's happening at the membrane. If you have the myelin sheath, then potassium can't leave the cell. And so we're just talking about the resistance right at the membrane. Yep. Okay, so if potassium can leak out, it can't propagate down the axon.
Is this only with graded potentials then? 'Cause
Yes, that's a
actions
good question.
don't decay.
Yes, thank you. Right, great point. This is only pertaining to graded potentials. Because what we're doing here is in between the nodes, that's where we're getting the action potentials, right? But in between the action potentials where the myelin sheath is, that's where the graded potentials are. And you're absolutely right. The lambda is describing the decay of the graded potentials. Very good point, thank you. Because it's graded potentials that decay with distance. Marathon session. I am like dying of heat. All right. Any last minute questions? Do you feel better about all the material, putting it all together? Yes.
I think you said this morning that the neuromuscular junction one is going to be on the next
Yes.
exam.
Yeah.
That's everything up to conduction of electrical
That's right.
pulse.
Right. So we'll start on Friday talking about neuromuscular junction. It'll just take a second. I think there's only 2 slides. And then we'll jump into what happens. What does the muscle, how does the muscle respond?
How many questions is this again?
This is 40 questions, multiple choice, and matching. No essay, nothing like that. Yes.
I think you're gonna give us like the.
I will have I will have a pile of worksheets, just the one sheet with all the equations on it, and I'll pass that out.
The definitions.
Oh, yes.
You know.
tonight I will email, I'll put it as an announcement, yeah. And I'll finish up the terminology, like all the terms that we talked about, and I'll send it to you.
I was looking at the equation sheet, and
Yeah.
it only has one of the forms of, R. Are we responsible to know the other one? I only saw the 8.2.
Yes, let me just make sure. That's a good point. If that's the case, I will adjust it. So this is the R for the Nernst equation. And then the R for, no, you're right. If it's not, I will check, but if it's not in the question itself, I'll make sure that it's on here. Yep. All right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming. Yes. All right. Yeah, thank you.